The eviction notice was salmon pink, the kind of color that screams urgency while pretending to be gentle. It sat on my kitchen counter, next to a half-empty coffee cup and a stack of rejection letters from landlords who'd found better tenants, ones without credit scores that looked like crime scenes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 60 days. That's all I had before the marshals would come with their clipboards and their practiced indifference, boxing up what little I'd managed to keep after the divorce. The apartment wasn't much. A one-bedroom walk-up in Queens with pipes that sang opera at 3 in the morning and a radiator that had given up pretending to work. But it was mine. Or it had been, until the rent increase that came with all the subtlety of a sledgehammer. I stared at the notice until the words blurred together. Then I heard Marcus's voice, clear as if he were standing right behind me, echoing what he'd said 6 months ago when I begged him not to take the house. "Face it, Sarah, you're not built for ownership. Some people rent their whole lives, and that's okay. That's you." The house had been ours for 3 years. A modest colonial in Westchester with a garden I'd planted from scratch and a kitchen where I'd learned to make pasta from his Italian grandmother's recipes. I'd paid the down payment with money from my grandmother's estate. I'd chosen the paint colors, installed the shelving, fixed the leaky faucet when Marcus was too busy with his hedge fund friends to notice it existed. But when the papers were signed, when the lawyers finished carving up our life like a Thanksgiving turkey, Marcus got the house, and I got a settlement that barely covered first month's rent and a security deposit in the city. His name had been on the mortgage. His credit score opened doors. His connections whispered recommendations. Mine had been the invisible labor that made the house a home. And invisible labor doesn't hold up in court. The knock at my door came at exactly 9:30, the kind of punctual that suggested either a process server or someone selling salvation. I wasn't interested in either. Through the peephole, I saw a woman in her 50s wearing a navy blazer and holding a manila envelope like it contained either very good news or very bad news. There was rarely anything in between with manila envelopes. "Sarah Chen?" she asked when I opened the door. I nodded, already calculating how much time I had to pack if this was another legal document, another demand for money I didn't have, another reminder that I existed at the mercy of people with better lawyers. "I'm Patricia Delacroix, and I have something that might interest you." She handed me the envelope. "I represent Meridian Properties. We've been following your case." My case? As if my divorce had become public entertainment, a cautionary tale whispered about in real estate circles. I took the envelope but didn't open it. "If this is about the apartment, I'm already looking for somewhere else." She tilted her head, studying me like I was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "It's not about where you're leaving, Miss Chen. It's about where you're going." Inside the envelope was a single sheet of letterhead paper. Expensive stock with raised lettering that spoke of serious money and serious intentions. At the top, an address in Manhattan. Below it, a brief paragraph that made no sense the first time I read it, and even less sense the second time. "The Penthouse at 432 Park Avenue has been selected for the Meridian Restoration Grant. As a recipient, you are entitled to immediate occupancy and full ownership transfer upon completion of a 2-year residency requirement. Please contact our offices to arrange viewing and key transfer." I read it again, then a third time. The words didn't change, but my understanding of them shifted like a kaleidoscope finding new patterns in the same broken glass. "There's been a mistake," I said finally. Patricia smiled, and it was the kind of smile that suggested she'd heard that response before. "There's no mistake. The grant is specifically designed for individuals who have faced housing instability due to circumstances beyond their control. You qualify." I thought of Marcus, of the house in Westchester, of the way he'd looked at me across the mediation table like I was already a stranger he was eager to forget. "I don't understand. I've never heard of this grant. I didn't apply for anything." "Sometimes," Patricia said, "the best opportunities find us when we're not looking for them." The viewing was scheduled for the following Tuesday at 3 o'clock, which meant I had to take time off from my job at the downtown law firm where I filed documents and fetched coffee for attorneys who made in an hour what I made in a week. My supervisor, Jennifer, had the kind of face that suggested she'd been personally inconvenienced by my existence since the day I was hired. "Another apartment viewing?" she asked when I requested the time off, her voice dripping with the particular disdain reserved for people who dared to have personal lives during business hours. "Something like that," I replied, not wanting to explain what I didn't understand myself. The building at 432 Park Avenue was one of those glass and steel monuments to excess that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a middle finger pointed at the clouds. I'd walked past it before, usually on my way to job interviews, that led nowhere, and I'd always wondered what kind of person could afford to live that high above the rest of the world. The lobby was all marble and hushed voices, the kind of place where even the elevator buttons seemed to judge your net worth before deciding whether to respond to your touch. Patricia was waiting for me near a reception desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. "Right on time," she said, leading me towards an elevator bank marked Private Residence. The elevator moved so smoothly I barely felt we were ascending. Just the subtle shift in air pressure that suggested we were climbing towards a different atmosphere entirely. When the doors opened, we weren't in a hallway. We were in a foyer, a private foyer with floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a living painting spread out below us. The penthouse occupies the entire 92nd floor, Patricia explained, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. 4 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, a chef's kitchen, library, and private terrace. The previous owner was Mr. Harrison Blackwood. The name hit me like cold water. Harrison Blackwood, the real estate mogul whose face appeared on Forbes covers and whose developments had reshaped half of Manhattan's skyline. The man whose empire had been built on transforming forgotten neighborhoods into playgrounds for the ultra-rich.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"What?" I managed to ask. "Mr. Blackwood passed away 3 months ago. The penthouse was part of his charitable foundation's endowment. He was very specific about the criteria for its disposition." We walked through rooms that seemed designed for a different species of human, one that required 30-foot ceilings and views that stretched to 3 states. The kitchen was larger than my entire apartment, with appliances that looked like they belonged on a spaceship. The master bedroom had a walk-in closet that could have housed a small family. But it was the library that stopped me cold. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with volumes that ranged from leather-bound classics to contemporary architecture journals. A reading chair sat near the window, positioned to catch both natural light and the city view. On the side table, a single book lay open, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. "The Architecture of Hope, Building Communities in Post-War America," I read the title aloud. Patricia nodded. Mr. Blackwood was researching affordable housing initiatives before his death. He believed that shelter was a fundamental right, not a commodity to be traded. I walked to the window, pressing my palm against the glass. Somewhere down there, in the canyon of streets and the maze of smaller buildings, was my apartment, with its eviction notice and its singing pipes. Somewhere out there was the house in Westchester, where Marcus was probably hosting dinner parties and telling his friends about his narrow escape from domestic mediocrity. "Why me?" I asked without turning around. Patricia's reflection appeared in the window beside mine. "That's not for me to say, but I can tell you that Mr. Blackwood's instructions were very specific. He wanted someone who had been denied ownership not through inability or unwillingness, but through systemic barriers. Someone who understood that a home is more than an investment portfolio." I thought about the garden I'd planted in Westchester, how I'd researched which flowers would bloom in sequence so there would be color from spring through fall. I thought about the kitchen shelves I'd installed, the careful measurements and the satisfaction of seeing them perfectly level. I thought about the way Marcus had shrugged when I'd asked if I could take the herb garden I'd cultivated, as if 3 years of carefully tended basil and rosemary were just weeds he'd be happy to have removed. "There must be conditions," I said. "People like me don't just get handed penthouses." "The residency requirement," Patricia confirmed. 2 years minimum. After that, the title transfers completely. There's also a small maintenance requirement, but nothing you couldn't handle with your current income. She handed me a set of keys, heavy silver things that felt substantial in my palm, as if they carried the weight of possibility along with their metal. Mr. Blackwood believed that sometimes the universe needs to correct its own mistakes. He saw housing inequality as one of those mistakes. I closed my fingers around the keys, feeling their sharp edges press into my skin. Real. Solid. Undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope, or maybe just the absence of despair, which was close enough to the same thing. "When can I move in?" I asked. "Whenever you're ready," Patricia replied. "Your residency begins the day you spend your first night here." Walking back through those enormous rooms, I tried to imagine my few possessions scattered through all that space. My secondhand furniture would look lost in the living room. My small collection of books would barely fill a single shelf in the library. But maybe that was okay. Maybe having room to grow was exactly what I needed. The elevator descended through the building's spine, carrying me back down to street level, back to the world where people like me weren't supposed to own penthouses on Park Avenue. But the keys were still in my hand, still solid and real, and mine. The moving truck looked ridiculous parked outside 432 Park Avenue. A dented white vehicle with mismatched tires and a driver who kept glancing up at the building like he expected security to escort him off the premises. My belongings filled exactly one corner of the truck bed, looking as lost as I felt. "You sure this is the right address, lady?" the driver asked for the third time, consulting his clipboard with the expression of a man who delivered furniture to studio apartments his entire career and couldn't reconcile this glass tower with my collection of IKEA basics. "I'm sure," I said, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The building's concierge, a silver-haired man named Thomas who wore his uniform like armor, had been expecting me. "Miss Chen, your residency is ready. The building staff has been briefed on your arrival." Briefed. As if I were visiting foreign dignitary rather than a woman fleeing an eviction notice with everything she owned fitting into the back of a Honda Civic. The penthouse felt different when it was actually mine to inhabit rather than just tour. The silence was deeper, more profound, the kind of quiet that comes from being suspended 92 floors above the noise of ordinary life. I walked from room to room, my footsteps echoing against the polished hardwood, trying to imagine filling all this space with a life that made sense. My phone buzzed against the marble kitchen counter. A text from my sister Lisa, the first communication I'd received from family since the divorce proceedings had concluded. "Heard you moved. Hope you found somewhere decent." I typed back without thinking. "Park Avenue." The response came within seconds. "Very funny. Where really?" I took a photo through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city spread out like a circuit board beneath a layer of afternoon haze. The reply was immediate. "Sarah, what the hell is this?" Before I could respond, my phone was ringing. Lisa's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who'd been personally affronted by reality, refusing to conform to her expectations. "Whose apartment are you in? Please tell me you didn't do something stupid like break into some rich person's place while they're in the Hamptons." "It's mine," I said, surprising myself with how the words felt in my mouth. "I got a grant." "A grant for a Park Avenue penthouse. Right. From who? The Fairy Godmother Foundation?" I explained about Meridian Properties, about Harrison Blackwood's charitable endowment, about the 2-year residency requirement. With each detail, Lisa's silence grew more skeptical. "This sounds like a scam," she said finally, "or like you're having some kind of breakdown. People like us don't get handed penthouses. This is the kind of fantasy you have when you've been spending too much time alone." People like us. The phrase hit exactly where it was meant to, settling into that familiar groove of diminished expectations that had been worn smooth by years of practice. People like us worked retail jobs and split electric bills and bought furniture from thrift stores. People like us were grateful for studio apartments and considered a parking space a luxury. "I have to go," I said, hanging up before she could continue cataloging all the reasons why my life had suddenly become impossible. That evening, I sat in the library with a cup of tea, watching the sun set behind the Hudson River. The book that had been open on the side table was still there, and I'd been reading it in small doses, trying to understand what had driven Harrison Blackwood to create a foundation that gave away penthouses to strangers. The chapters detailed post-war housing initiatives, the ways that government policy and private investment had either created opportunities or erected barriers. Blackwood had made notes in the margins, his handwriting sharp and economical. One passage was heavily underlined. Housing policy is social policy. Every zoning decision, every mortgage approval, every eviction notice is a choice about who deserves to belong. My laptop sat open on the desk beside me, the cursor blinking in an empty Google search box. I had been meaning to research Harrison Blackwood more thoroughly, to understand who he'd been beyond the Forbes profiles and business journal headlines. Now I typed his name and waited for the familiar flood of results. The top hits were predictable. Obituaries from major newspapers celebrating his contributions to Manhattan's skyline and his philanthropic endeavors. Business profiles detailing his rise from middle-class origins to real estate titan. Photos from charity galas where he stood beside politicians and celebrities, always slightly apart from the crowd, as if even in success he remained an observer rather than a participant. But buried deeper in the search results was something unexpected. A small article from a Queens community newspaper dated 18 months earlier. The headline read, "Local developer faces displacement as building sells to luxury chain." The article was brief, focusing on a community development project in Astoria that had provided affordable housing for working families. The building had been sold to a luxury hotel chain, displacing dozens of residents with minimal notice and inadequate relocation assistance. Among those displaced was a woman named Elena Blackwood, identified as a widow living on Social Security, who had called the building home for 15 years. I read the article 3 times before the connection crystallized. Elena Blackwood, Harrison's mother. Another search revealed more pieces of the story. Elena Blackwood had died 4 months after her displacement while living in a temporary housing facility in the Bronx. The official cause was pneumonia, but the community advocates quoted in later articles painted a clearer picture. An elderly woman, uprooted from her home, separated from her support network, dying alone in a place that had never been meant to be permanent. Harrison Blackwood had built an empire on luxury real estate while his own mother was displaced by gentrification. The irony was surgical in its precision. I closed the laptop and walked to the windows, looking down at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Somewhere in those lights were other people facing eviction notices, other families being priced out of neighborhoods their grandparents had called home. The penthouse suddenly felt less like a gift and more like a question. What do you do when you benefit from a system that has hurt others? My phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't Lisa, but a number I recognized from the lawyer's office where I worked. Jennifer, my supervisor, calling after hours, which meant either an emergency or an opportunity for her to demonstrate her authority during my personal time. Sarah. Her voice was clipped, efficient. I need you to come in early tomorrow. We have a new client, high-profile case, and I need someone to organize the files. How early? 7. And dress professionally. This client has standards. I almost laughed. Here I was, sitting in a penthouse worth more than Jennifer would earn in a lifetime, being lectured about professionalism by someone who thought power meant making other people's lives smaller. I'll be there, I said, because I wasn't ready to burn bridges, not when I didn't fully understand what I'd been given or why. After I hung up, I walked through the penthouse again, but this time I was seeing it differently, not as an impossibility that had happened to me, but as a responsibility I hadn't asked for. Harrison Blackwood hadn't just given me a place to live. He'd given me a position, a platform, a kind of power I'd never possessed before. The question was, what to do with it? I spent the evening researching the Meridian Restoration Grant.
digging through tax filings and foundation documents that were publicly available but buried deep enough that most people would never find them. The grant program was small, selective, funding only a handful of recipients each year. The criteria were specific: individuals who had experienced housing displacement due to divorce, medical bankruptcy, or employment discrimination. People who had been pushed out of stability not by their own failures, but by systems that prioritized profit over people. Each recipient was chosen not randomly, but strategically. A single mother in Detroit had received a restored Victorian house after being displaced by medical debt. A veteran in Phoenix had been granted a renovated adobe home after losing his apartment to a rent increase he couldn't afford on his disability payments. A teacher in Baltimore had been given a row house after her school district's budget cuts eliminated her position.
The pattern was clear. Harrison Blackwood had been making targeted corrections, small interventions in lives that had been derailed by forces beyond individual control. But why? And why me specifically? I found my answer in the last place I looked, in a folder on the library desk marked Personal Correspondence. Inside was a single letter, handwritten on cream-colored stationery. The return address was from a nursing home in Queens, dated 6 months before Harrison Blackwood's death. "Dear Harry," the letter began in handwriting that shook with age but remained determinately legible. "I know you think I'm angry with you about the apartment, but I want you to understand something before it's too late. The building wasn't just where I lived. It was where I belonged. When they made us leave, they didn't just take our homes. They took our stories. Every family displaced is a story interrupted, and stories interrupted are people erased. Don't let money make you forget that shelter isn't about square footage or market value. It's about the right to exist somewhere without permission from people who see us as inconveniences. I love you, and I'm proud of what you've built, but build something different now. Build belonging for people who've been told they don't deserve it. Love, Mom." I set the letter down carefully, as if it might dissolve under too much handling. Elena Blackwood had died 4 months later, but not before giving her son a final mission. The Meridian Restoration Grant wasn't charity, it was penance, redemption, an attempt to balance scales that had been tilted by an entire industry built on exclusion. And somehow, I had become part of that balance. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from a number I didn't recognize, but the message made my blood freeze in my veins. "Heard you upgraded your living situation. Too bad you can't upgrade your character. Still the same failure I married, just with a better address. Enjoy it while it lasts. M." Marcus had found me, which meant he knew about the penthouse, which meant he was already calculating how to take this away from me too. Just like he'd taken the house, just like he'd taken my sense of security, just like he'd taken my ability to believe I deserved good things without earning them through someone else's approval. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Elena Blackwood's interrupted story, for Harrison's attempt at redemption, for every person who'd been told they didn't deserve to belong somewhere beautiful. This time, I had something more than hope. I had keys and a dead man's mission and 92 floors between me and the people who thought they could make me disappear. The law firm buzzed with the particular energy of a place where other people's crises were converted into billable hours. I arrived at 7 sharp as ordered to find Jennifer already stationed at her desk with a stack of files and the expression of someone who'd been personally victimized by my existence since dawn. "The Morrison case," she said without looking up. "Divorce proceeding, high net worth, messy. The husband wants everything documented, every asset cataloged. Start with the real estate portfolio." She handed me a folder thick enough to choke on. Inside were property deeds, mortgage documents, and photographs of houses that belonged in architectural magazines. Beach houses in the Hamptons, a ski lodge in Aspen, a penthouse overlooking Central Park. My hands stilled on the last photograph. 432 Park Avenue. Penthouse. Current market value, $47 million. The listing details made my vision blur. Ultra-luxury residence featuring panoramic city views, chef's kitchen, private elevator access, and bespoke finishes throughout. Recently transferred to private foundation, not available for purchase. I read the description 3 times before the implications hit me like a freight train. Marcus's divorce case. Morrison. Marcus Morrison. Not Marcus Chen, because he'd never taken my name during our marriage. Said it would be too confusing for his business contacts. He was divorcing someone new. Someone wealthy enough to own property worth more money than most people saw in a lifetime. And somehow, he was trying to claim the penthouse where I now lived. Jennifer's voice cut through my paralysis. Problem with the files? I shook my head, forcing my hands steady as I organized the documents. But inside, every nerve was firing warning signals. Marcus didn't believe in coincidences, and neither did his lawyers. If the penthouse had appeared in his case file, it meant he'd been digging, investigating, building a legal strategy around something he wanted to take away. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of property valuations and asset inventories. Marcus's new wife, Vivian Morrison, had apparently accumulated quite a portfolio during their brief marriage, but buried in the financial documents was something that made my stomach drop through the floor. A legal brief, filed by Marcus's attorney, challenging the validity of certain charitable grants made by the Blackwood Foundation. The argument was technical, wrapped in language about fiduciary responsibility and proper vetting procedures, but the intent was clear. If the grants were deemed invalid, the properties would revert to the foundation's control, and from there, they could be claimed as marital assets subject to division. Marcus wasn't just coming for me. He was coming for everyone Blackwood had tried to help. My phone buzzed one more time. A text from an unknown number, but the message made my blood freeze in my veins. Heard you upgraded your living situation. Too bad you can't upgrade your character. Still the same failure I married, just with a better address. Enjoy it while it lasts. M. Marcus had found me, which meant he knew about the penthouse, which meant he was already calculating how to take this away from me too. Just like he'd taken the house, just like he'd taken my sense of security, just like he'd taken my ability to believe I deserved good things without earning them through someone else's approval. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Elena Blackwood's interrupted story, for Harrison's attempt at redemption, for every person who'd been told they didn't deserve to belong somewhere beautiful. This time, I had something more than hope. I had keys and a dead man's mission and 92 floors between me and the people who thought they could make me disappear.
He'd always been good at making threats sound like invitations. I spent my lunch break in the firm's law library, researching everything I could find about charitable grant challenges. The legal precedent was sparse but troubling. Foundations could be sued for improper distribution of assets, especially if the distributions appeared arbitrary or if proper due diligence hadn't been followed in recipient selection. Marcus's strategy was elegant in its cruelty. He couldn't challenge my right to live in the penthouse directly, but he could challenge the foundation's right to have given it to me in the first place. If he succeeded, every grant recipient would lose their homes, and the properties would enter a legal limbo where they could potentially be claimed by anyone with standing to sue, including the estranged husband of a foundation board member. I called Patricia Delacroix from the library's quiet corner, keeping my voice low enough that the law students at nearby tables couldn't overhear. "There's something you didn't tell me," I said when she answered, "about the grant selection process, about why me specifically." A pause. "What makes you ask?" "Because my ex-husband is trying to challenge the foundation's grants, and I need to know if there's something about my selection that won't hold up in court." Another pause. Longer this time. "Can we meet?" "Tonight, 7 o'clock, the lobby of your building. This isn't a conversation for phones." I agreed, hung up, and stared at the pile of legal texts surrounding me. Outside the library windows, the city continued its relentless rhythm of commerce and ambition, people moving through their lives with the confidence that their foundations were solid, their ground was steady. Mine had been shifting since the day I'd received that salmon pink eviction notice, and now it felt like standing on a tectonic plate during an earthquake. Java House was exactly the kind of place Marcus would choose for a power meeting. Expensive enough to establish dominance, public enough to prevent dramatic scenes, and familiar enough that he'd know where to sit for optimal psychological advantage. I arrived 5 minutes late, a small rebellion that felt both petty and necessary. He was waiting at a corner table, dressed in the charcoal suit that had always been his armor of choice for important negotiations. Thinner than I remembered, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of stress, or guilt, or just the natural progression of a man entering his 40s without grace. "Sarah," he stood when I approached, a gesture that might have seemed polite to observers but felt like a performance of courtesies he'd never bothered to extend during our marriage. I didn't return the social niceties. "What do you want, Marcus?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Coffee first? You look tired." "I'm fine. You said we needed to discuss my housing situation." His smile was the same one he'd worn during our divorce proceedings, practiced and predatory. "I was surprised to hear about your upgrade. Park Avenue Penthouse. Very impressive. Though I have to admit, I was curious about how someone with your financial situation managed to secure something so far above market rate." "It's none of your business." "Actually, it might be more my business than you realize." He leaned back in his chair, the gesture of someone holding cards they were eager to reveal. "The property you're living in belongs to the Blackwood Foundation, which is currently under legal review for questionable distribution practices. My attorney has filed a motion to freeze all recent grants pending a full audit of the foundation's decision-making process." I kept my face neutral, a skill I'd learned for 3 years of marriage to someone who fed on emotional reactions like a shark sensing blood in the water. "Your point?" "My point is that you're living in a property that may not have been legally granted to you. When the audit reveals the irregularities in your selection, you'll be facing eviction again. But," he leaned forward, "I might be able to help you avoid that embarrassment. Let me guess. You want something in return. I want you to voluntarily surrender your claim to the property and support my legal challenge to the foundation. In exchange, I'll ensure you receive a cash settlement sufficient to secure more appropriate housing." More appropriate housing. Translation: something small and forgettable, somewhere far enough away that he wouldn't have to acknowledge my existence in his new life with his new wife and her real estate empire. "And if I refuse?" His smile widened. "Then you'll fight a legal battle you can't afford against attorneys you can't match, and you'll lose everything anyway. But this way, you walk away with something instead of nothing." I stood up slowly, deliberately, taking time to smooth my jacket and gather my purse. "Marcus," I said, my voice carrying clearly enough for the nearby tables to overhear, "you spent 3 years trying to make me smaller, and I let you because I thought love meant accommodation. But you taught me something valuable about the difference between power and control." His confidence flickered for just a moment. "Power is what I have now. A home that can't be taken away by someone else's signature on divorce papers. Control is what you're trying to exercise, and it only works on people who believe they deserve whatever scraps you're willing to throw them." I leaned down, close enough that only he could hear my next words. "I'm not that person anymore. See you in court." Patricia was waiting in the lobby when I returned, dressed in the same navy blazer, but somehow appearing more formal, more official. She stood when she saw me, her expression serious enough to make my stomach clench with fresh anxiety. "We need to talk about Harrison Blackwood's selection criteria, and about why your ex-husband's legal challenge is more dangerous than you might realize." We rode the elevator to the penthouse in silence, but once we were inside, Patricia walked straight to the library and pulled out a file I hadn't seen before. Thick manila folder marked confidential, grant recipients. "Harrison didn't choose recipients randomly," she began, settling into the reading chair by the window. "Each selection was carefully researched, methodically planned. He was looking for specific types of cases, people who had been harmed by the same systems that had made his fortune." She opened the file, revealing photographs and documents I recognized as background investigations. Credit reports, employment histories, legal documents from divorce proceedings. My divorce proceedings.
"He knew about your marriage to Marcus Morrison," Patricia continued.
He knew about the house you lost, the settlement that barely covered first month's rent, the way your ex-husband used his financial advantages to leave you with nothing. But more than that, he knew Marcus was planning to marry Vivian Morrison. I stared at the documents, seeing my life reduced to data points and legal findings. I don't understand. Vivian Morrison was Harrison's business partner 20 years ago. They developed 3 luxury properties together before she married her first husband and became independently wealthy. When Harrison discovered that Marcus Morrison was targeting wealthy women for strategic marriages, he realized he could kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The room seemed to tilt slightly, reality rearranging itself around new information. He gave me the penthouse to get back at Marcus? He gave you the penthouse because you deserved it, and because Marcus deserved to lose something he thought he could control. But yes, there was a strategic element. Harrison knew Marcus would eventually try to claim the property through his marriage to Vivian. He also knew that if Marcus succeeded, it would destroy the foundation's ability to help anyone else. Patricia pulled out another document, this one bearing official letterhead from Harrison's personal attorney. This is why your ex-husband's challenge is so dangerous. Harrison anticipated it, and he prepared accordingly. But his preparations require something from you that you might not be willing to give. I took the document, scanning the legal language until I found the relevant section. My hands began to shake as I read. In the event that the Foundation's grants are legally challenged by Marcus Morrison or his representatives, the recipient, Sarah Chen, is hereby authorized and required to assume full ownership of the Meridian Restoration Grant Program, including all assets, properties, and ongoing obligations. I looked up at Patricia, who was watching me with something that might have been sympathy or might have been calculation. "He didn't just give you a penthouse," she said quietly. "He gave you a foundation. The question is, are you ready to use it?" The courtroom smelled like old wood and fresh ambition. Lawyers in expensive suits shuffled papers while their clients sat in the gallery, watching their lives be dissected by strangers who charged by the hour. I sat in the front row behind Patricia, wearing the one good suit I owned and trying to project confidence I didn't feel. Marcus sat across the aisle with his legal team, 3 attorneys who moved with the synchronized precision of sharks who'd scented blood. He hadn't looked at me once since entering the courtroom, but I could feel his presence like a headache brewing behind my eyes. Judge Reynolds entered with the wearied expression of someone who'd spent decades watching people fight over money they'd never earned and houses they'd never lived in. She settled behind her bench and surveyed the room with the particular skepticism reserved for cases that promised to waste everyone's time while generating impressive legal fees. "This is a motion to freeze assets pending investigation of charitable distribution practices," she began, consulting her notes. "Mr. Morrison's counsel alleges that the Blackwood Foundation engaged in improper grant procedures. Ms. Delacroix, representing the foundation, argues that all distributions were conducted according to established legal protocols." Marcus's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Whitman, who probably charged more per hour than most people earned in a month, stood to address the court. "Your Honor, my client's investigation has revealed a pattern of questionable decision-making by the deceased foundation director. Properties worth tens of millions of dollars were distributed to individuals with no apparent qualifications, no applications on file, and no documented vetting procedures. This appears to be less charitable giving than personal whim disguised as philanthropy." He gestured towards a stack of documents that his paralegal had wheeled in on a cart. "We have evidence that at least 6 properties were granted to individuals specifically chosen to disadvantage my client's interests, suggesting that these were not legitimate charitable acts, but targeted harassment conducted through a tax-exempt entity." Judge Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "Targeted harassment is a serious allegation, Counselor." "Indeed, Your Honor. My client was deliberately selected for financial harm by a foundation that used charitable status to conduct personal vendettas." I watched Marcus as Whitman spoke, noting the way he sat perfectly still, hands folded, expression neutral.
It was the same pose he had adopted during our divorce proceedings when his attorney was arguing that I deserved nothing from the sale of the house I'd helped choose, helped buy, helped maintain for 3 years. Patricia stood when Whitman finished. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent decades navigating legal waters that had drowned lesser advocates. Your Honor, Mr. Morrison's allegations are both factually incorrect and legally irrelevant. The Blackwood Foundation operates under established charitable guidelines with full IRS approval. Every grant recipient was selected according to documented criteria focusing on individuals who had experienced housing displacement due to circumstances beyond their control. She moved towards the evidence table, pulling out a thick binder. Mr. Morrison characterizes these distributions as arbitrary, but the Foundation's records show extensive research and documentation for each recipient. Moreover, the suggestion that charitable giving becomes invalid because it disadvantages someone who was not entitled to the assets in question is legally absurd. Judge Reynolds leaned forward. Counselor, can you explain the relationship between your client and Mr. Morrison that forms the basis for his harassment allegations? Certainly, Your Honor. Mr. Morrison was previously married to Miss Sarah Chen, one of our grant recipients. During their divorce, Mr. Morrison used superior financial resources to claim sole ownership of marital property, leaving Ms. Chen homeless despite her financial contributions to the property acquisition. The Foundation's grant to Ms. Chen was made according to our standard criteria for individuals who had lost housing through divorce-related displacement. She paused, allowing the implications to settle. Mr. Morrison's current legal action appears to be motivated by his discovery that his former wife now lives in a property he cannot control or claim, which suggests that this motion itself is a form of targeted harassment. Whitman immediately objected, but Judge Reynolds waved him silent. Mr. Morrison, you're asking this court to invalidate charitable distributions because one of the recipients is your former wife? Marcus stood smoothly. Your Honor, my personal relationship with Miss Chen is irrelevant to the Foundation's failure to follow proper procedures. But it's not irrelevant to your motivation for bringing this challenge, Judge Reynolds replied dryly.
Continue, Miss Delacroix. Patricia pulled out another document, this one bearing Harrison Blackwood's personal letterhead. Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence a letter written by Harrison Blackwood 6 months before his death, specifically addressing the possibility that his charitable work might be challenged by individuals who had financially benefited from the systems he was trying to address. She cleared her throat and began reading. I am aware that my decision to direct Foundation resources toward correcting specific instances of housing inequality may be perceived as targeted intervention rather than general charity. However, I would argue that effective charity must be targeted to be meaningful. Random acts of kindness may salve the conscience, but strategic intervention in documented injustices serves the greater good. Patricia continued reading. I anticipate that some individuals who benefited from the systems that displaced my grant recipients may challenge these distributions. To those individuals, I say this. Charity is not required to be comfortable for those who profit from the problems being addressed. If my grants cause discomfort to people who gained wealth by harming others, that discomfort is not a legal injury, but a moral adjustment. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Reynolds studied the letter, her expression unreadable. Mr. Whitman, your client's motion requests that this court determine charitable distributions invalid because they were strategically directed rather than randomly distributed. Are you prepared to argue that targeted charity is inherently illegitimate? Whitman shifted slightly. Your Honor, our argument is that personal animus should not drive charitable decision-making. But you haven't demonstrated personal animus, Judge Reynolds replied. You've demonstrated strategic philanthropy directed toward correcting documented inequities. The fact that your client was disadvantaged by someone else's good fortune is not grounds for invalidating that good fortune. She set the letter aside and looked directly at Marcus. Mr. Morrison, this court will not be used to relitigate your divorce or to punish your former wife for receiving assistance you believe she doesn't deserve. Your motion to freeze Foundation assets is denied.
The gavel fell with finality that echoed through the courtroom like a door slamming shut. Marcus walked past me without acknowledgement, his legal team trailing behind like expensive shadows. But at the courtroom door, he stopped and turned back. "This isn't over," he said, loud enough for me to hear, but quiet enough that it wouldn't constitute a courtroom disturbance. "Yes, it is," I replied, standing to face him directly. "You don't get to take this one, Marcus. You don't get to make me homeless again because you can't stand that I have something you can't control." He smiled, but it was empty, mechanical. "Enjoy the penthouse, Sarah. But remember, everything you have came from a dead man's guilt. You're still living off someone else's charity. And you're still living off someone else's money. At least my benefactor didn't expect me to pretend to love him in return." His face flushed red, but before he could respond, Patricia's hand was on my elbow, guiding me toward the exit. "Let it go," she murmured. "You won. Don't let him bait you into giving him ammunition for an appeal." Outside the courthouse, the city buzzed with its usual indifferent energy. People hurried past on sidewalks that had witnessed thousands of legal victories and defeats, each one momentarily significant to the participants, ultimately invisible to the larger flow of urban life. Patricia handed me a set of keys I didn't recognize. "These are for the foundation office. Harrison's personal attorney will meet with you next week to discuss the transition. You'll need to review all current grant applications, approve or deny pending distributions, and establish protocols for future recipient selection." I stared at the keys, feeling their weight. I don't know how to run a foundation. Neither did Harrison when he started. But you know what it feels like to need help and be told you don't deserve it. That's better qualification than most foundation directors possess. She hailed a taxi, then turned back to me. "One more thing. Harrison left specific instructions about what to do if Marcus Morrison ever succeeded in challenging the grants." My stomach clenched. "What instructions?" "Documentation of every financial irregularity Marcus committed during your marriage. Tax evasion, hidden assets, fraudulent declarations to mortgage companies. Harrison had private investigators compile a comprehensive file." She handed me a business card. "If Marcus tries to challenge you again, this attorney specializes in financial crimes prosecution. Harrison wanted to make sure you had options beyond just defending yourself." The taxi pulled away, leaving me standing on the courthouse steps with keys to a foundation I'd never asked for and weapons against a man I'd once loved. The weight of both felt heavier than the penthouse keys had, more dangerous, more permanent. My phone buzzed. A text from my sister Lisa. "Saw the news article about your court case. Are you really running a foundation now?" I typed back, "Apparently." "That's incredible. I'm proud of you." 3 words I hadn't heard from family in years. I saved the message, then walked toward the subway that would take me back to Park Avenue, to the penthouse that was no longer just shelter, but headquarters, to the life I was still learning how to live without permission. On the train, surrounded by strangers heading home to apartments and houses they rented or owned or shared, I thought about Harrison Blackwood's letter, about strategic charity and moral adjustments. He'd been right about one thing. Effective change required targeted intervention, not random kindness. Marcus had taught me about power through its absence, about worth through its denial, about home through its loss. Now I had the chance to teach others different lessons, about deserving good things, about fighting systems that said otherwise, about the difference between charity and justice.
Tomorrow, I would start reviewing grant applications. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of helping other people write different endings to stories that had started with eviction notices and divorce papers, and the particular cruelty of being told they didn't deserve the good things they'd worked to build. Tonight, I would sit in the library of my penthouse and read about strategic philanthropy and moral adjustments, about the architecture of hope and the engineering of belonging. Tonight, I would plan how to use the foundation Harrison Blackwood had entrusted to me, not as charity, but as justice with better funding and a 92nd floor view. 6 months later, the foundation office occupied the entire 42nd floor of a building in Midtown Manhattan. Floor-to-ceiling windows provided a view of the city that had once seemed impossible to inhabit, now transformed into a landscape of potential interventions and strategic corrections. The space hummed with purposeful activity.
caseworkers reviewing applications, attorneys vetting legal documents, investigators conducting background research on both recipients and the systems that had displaced them. I stood at the main conference table, surrounded by files that represented more than documentation. Each folder contained a story interrupted, a life derailed by forces beyond individual control, a person who had been told they didn't deserve stability and had believed it long enough to stop fighting. The morning's agenda included 12 new applications, 3 legal challenges to previous grants, and a meeting with city housing officials who had finally agreed to discuss systemic reforms. Maria Santos, our lead caseworker, spread photographs across the table. A family of 4 living in a hotel room after their apartment building was sold to developers. An elderly man sleeping in his car after his rent-controlled unit was eliminated through owner move-in evictions. A veteran whose disability benefits weren't sufficient to cover market-rate housing in the city where her VA medical care was located. Stories that had become familiar, not because they were rare, but because they were epidemic. The Santos family has been displaced for 8 months, Maria reported, her voice carrying the controlled emotion of someone who'd learned to process tragedy as data without losing sight of its human cost. Father works 2 jobs, mother is recovering from cancer treatment, both children maintaining honor roll grades despite changing schools 3 times this year. The hotel where they're staying costs more per month than a mortgage payment would, but they can't qualify for a loan because they don't have a permanent address. I studied the application photographs. The father's eyes held the particular exhaustion of someone working multiple jobs while watching his family's stability crumble in real time. The mother's smile was practiced, the kind developed to reassure children that temporary sacrifices were adventures rather than emergencies. The children looked directly at the camera with the premature seriousness of kids who'd learned that home was a privilege, not a given. Recommended property? I asked. 2-bedroom in Queens, owner financed through our partnership program. The seller is a retired teacher who inherited the property and prefers stable families over maximum profit. She's agreed to a 5-year lease with option to buy, payments structured around the father's current income. I signed the approval without hesitation. Each signature had become easier, not because the responsibility felt lighter, but because the mission had crystallized into something unshakable. We weren't just providing housing, we were correcting market failures that treated shelter as commodity rather than necessity. My phone buzzed against the conference table. Patricia's name appeared on the screen, which meant either excellent news or complicated problems requiring immediate attention. With Patricia, there was rarely anything between those extremes. "We have a situation," she said when I answered. "Marcus Morrison has filed a federal complaint alleging that the foundation is operating as a criminal conspiracy to defraud property owners and manipulate real estate markets." The room seemed to shift slightly, the familiar sensation of solid ground becoming less reliable than. Around the table, my staff continued their work, unaware that their jobs, their mission, and the ability to help families like the Santos might be under attack by someone whose only injury was the inconvenience of his ex-wife's improved circumstances. "What's the scope of the complaint?" I asked, walking toward the windows where the city spread out in patterns that suddenly looked more fragile than permanent. "Comprehensive. He's alleging wire fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy to interfere with business relationships, and racketeering. He claims that the foundation uses charitable status to conduct economic warfare against property owners, landlords, and real estate investors." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of every decision I'd made since inheriting Harrison's mission. Every grant approved, every house housed, every correction to market-driven displacement was now being characterized as criminal activity by someone who viewed my existence as a personal affront to his vision of how the world should work. How strong is his case? Legally, it's garbage wrapped in expensive legal stationery. But politically, it's dangerous. The allegations are serious enough to trigger federal investigation, and investigations can freeze our operations even if they ultimately find no wrongdoing. Through the conference room's glass walls, I could see Maria explaining something to one of our newer caseworkers, using hand gestures that suggested she was describing the particular challenges of working with families who'd been homeless long enough to develop defensive strategies against hope. The veteran whose disability benefits weren't sufficient for market-rate housing sat in our waiting area reading a magazine with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to occupy time without appearing to need anything from anyone. "Schedule a meeting with our legal team," I said. "If Marcus wants to turn this into a federal case, we'll give him more federal case than he bargained for." 3 hours later, I sat across from Amanda Rodriguez, the attorney Patricia had recommended 6 months earlier when she had mentioned Harrison's contingency plans for dealing with Marcus's future challenges. Amanda specialized in white-collar criminal defense, but her background included prosecutorial work focusing on financial crimes and tax evasion. She reviewed Marcus's complaint with the expression of someone who'd seen similar documents many times and found them predictably unimpressive. "Your ex-husband has made a strategic error," she said, closing the thick folder that contained the federal complaint. "By escalating this to criminal allegations, he's opened himself up to discovery processes that will examine his own financial activities. And according to the files Harrison Blackwood compiled, those activities include several potentially prosecutable offenses." She pulled out a separate folder, this one bearing Harrison's personal letterhead and marked with security classifications that suggested its contents were more explosive than I'd realized. Tax evasion through offshore shell companies, mortgage fraud involving inflated property valuations, and manipulation of divorce asset declarations to avoid community property obligations. Harrison's investigators were thorough. I stared at the folder, understanding that it contained enough ammunition to destroy Marcus's new marriage, his business relationships, and potentially his freedom. The weight of that power felt heavier than the foundation keys had, more dangerous than the penthouse deed, and more permanent than any legal victory. "What are you recommending?" "Counter-prosecution. File federal charges for the crimes he actually committed while he's trying to prosecute you for crimes you didn't commit. The irony will not be lost on federal prosecutors, and the media attention will shift from charity under investigation to real estate fraudster attacks housing foundation." Amanda opened the folder and began spreading documents across the table. Bank records showing transfers to accounts in countries with banking secrecy laws, property appraisals that had been inflated by 30% to support mortgage applications, divorce filings that listed assets significantly below their actual values to minimize community property calculations. Each document represented a choice Marcus had made to prioritize his advantage over legal requirements, ethical obligations, or basic honesty. "The mortgage fraud alone carries a potential 20-year sentence," Amanda continued. "The tax evasion adds another 5 years, and the divorce perjury could result in complete reversal of the original settlement, meaning you'd be entitled to claim half of everything he hid during the proceedings." I picked up one of the documents, a bank statement showing a transfer of $200,000 to an account in the Cayman Islands, dated 3 days before our divorce settlement conference. Money that should have been disclosed as marital asset, money that would have changed the entire calculation of who owed what to whom. How long would prosecution take? 18 months minimum, potentially 3 years if he fights it aggressively. During that time, his assets would be frozen, his business activities would be under federal oversight, and his ability to finance legal challenges to your foundation would be severely limited. The conference room fell quiet except for the ambient sound of traffic 90 floors below and the air conditioning system that maintained perfect climate control regardless of the moral weather systems moving through the space. Outside, the city continued its relentless rhythm of construction and commerce, people building lives on foundations they hoped were solid enough to support their dreams.
"There's another option," I said, finally. Amanda raised an eyebrow. "We don't file charges. We don't pursue prosecution. We just make sure he knows that we could."
Blackmail? Information sharing. Marcus responds to power dynamics, not moral arguments. If he understands that challenging the foundation will result in federal prosecution for his own crimes, he'll withdraw his complaint and find other ways to occupy his time. Amanda leaned back in her chair, studying me with something that might have been respect or might have been concern. That's a dangerous game. If he calls your bluff and you don't follow through, you lose all credibility. If he doesn't call your bluff but later discovers you were never planning to prosecute, he could use your threats as evidence of extortion. And if we prosecute him directly? Then you become someone who uses federal prosecutors as weapons in personal disputes. The foundation's mission gets overshadowed by headlines about vindictive ex-wives and billionaire revenge schemes. I walked to the windows again, looking down at the patterns of traffic and pedestrians that represented millions of individual decisions about where to go, how to get there, what risks were worth taking. Each person moving through those streets was navigating their own version of the choices I was facing: how much power to use, when mercy became enabling, and where justice intersected with revenge. My phone rang. Maria's name on the screen, which meant either urgent foundation business or one of our grant families was facing immediate crisis. With our current caseload, both possibilities were equally likely. "Sarah, we have a problem with the Morrison case," she said, her voice tight with stress. "Vivian Morrison called to report that her husband has cleaned out their joint accounts and disappeared. She's asking if the foundation can help her avoid foreclosure on her properties while she locates hidden assets." The irony hit me like ice water. Marcus's new wife, the woman whose wealth he'd married to secure his financial future, was now facing the same asset concealment and abandonment that I'd experienced during our divorce. History wasn't repeating itself. It was revealing patterns that had been consistent all along. "Schedule a meeting with Mrs. Morrison," I said. "Standard application process, same criteria we use for all displacement cases." "Are you sure? Given the federal complaint and the publicity around your history with her husband, this could be seen as conflict of interest." I thought about the Santos family in their hotel room when we'd first reviewed their application. They were now in their house in Queens, the children enrolled in a school they'd be able to attend for more than a few months, the parents working jobs that paid enough to cover mortgage payments instead of temporary lodging that cost twice as much and provided no equity. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, but I recognized the tone immediately.
Congratulations on your federal press conference. I hope you enjoyed your moment in the spotlight. Because it won't last, this isn't over. I deleted the message without responding, then blocked the number. Some conversations had already been concluded by actions rather than words, and some people needed to be ignored into irrelevance rather than engaged into continued conflict. 6 months later, Marcus Morrison was serving 18 months in federal prison for tax evasion and mortgage fraud. Vivian Morrison had completed the foundation's housing assistance program and was working as a volunteer coordinator, helping other women navigate divorce proceedings complicated by hidden assets and financial manipulation. The foundation had expanded to include 3 additional cities and was processing more than 200 applications per month. I sat in the Penthouse library on a Sunday morning, reading grant applications while the city stretched out below in the soft light of early autumn. The book that Harrison Blackwood had left open on the reading table was now shelved alongside volumes on housing policy, nonprofit management, and federal regulations governing charitable organizations. But his letter from his mother remained in the desk drawer, a reminder that effective charity began with understanding the difference between shelter and belonging. The doorbell rang, which was unusual for a Sunday morning and impossible unless someone had been cleared through building security. Through the intercom, Thomas, the concierge, announced that there was a young woman in the lobby asking to speak with me about the foundation. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's urgent and that she's been displaced with nowhere else to go. Should I send her up or schedule something through the office tomorrow? I thought about Harrison Blackwood's selection criteria, about strategic philanthropy and moral adjustments, about the difference between helping people and helping systems change the conditions that made help necessary. "Send her up," I said. The elevator doors opened to reveal a woman perhaps 25 years old, carrying a backpack and a manila envelope that looked familiar. Her eyes held the particular combination of hope and desperation that I'd seen in every grant application photo, every case file, every person who'd been told that their displacement was temporary inconvenience rather than systematic violence. "Ms. Chen, I'm Rebecca Martinez," she said. "I've been following the Foundation's work, and I think I might qualify for assistance. But more than that, I think I might be able to help you expand the program." She handed me the manila envelope. Inside were documents I recognized: eviction notices, divorce papers, employment termination letters, medical bills that had transformed minor health issues into financial catastrophes, but also business plans, policy proposals, and architectural drawings for transitional housing developments that could serve hundreds of families while generating enough revenue to be financially sustainable. I was a city planner before my husband decided he preferred his secretary to his wife. I lost the house, the job, and the health insurance in the same month, but I spent the last year researching housing policy and developing models for community-controlled development that could prevent displacement rather than just respond to it. I gestured toward the reading chairs by the window, the same spot where Patricia had first explained Harrison Blackwood's mission, and where I'd realized that inheriting a penthouse meant inheriting responsibility for people I'd never met, but whose stories intersected with my own. "Tell me about your ideas," I said. As Rebecca outlined her proposals for community land trusts, cooperative housing developments, and tenant-controlled rental properties, I realized that the Foundation was evolving from providing individual assistance to systemic intervention. We weren't just helping people find housing, we were working to change the conditions that made housing insecure for entire communities. The conversation continued through the afternoon, ranging from zoning reform to municipal bond financing to federal policy changes that could transform housing from commodity speculation to community infrastructure. By evening, we had outlined a 5-year expansion plan that would establish Foundation offices in 12 cities and develop model programs that other organizations could replicate. "Why do you want to work with us instead of starting your own organization?" I asked, as the sun set behind the Hudson River, painting the Penthouse library in shades of gold and amber. "Because you've already proven that strategic charity works," Rebecca replied. "And because I think Harrison Blackwood would have wanted his foundation to become something bigger than correcting individual injustices. I think he would have wanted it to become a model for preventing those injustices from happening in the first place." I thought about Elena Blackwood's letter about interrupted stories and people erased by displacement. I thought about Marcus Morrison, now experiencing firsthand what it felt like when someone with more power decided that your stability was less important than their advantage. I thought about the Santos family and their house in Queens, and the hundreds of other families we'd helped find not just shelter, but belonging. "When can you start?" I asked. Rebecca smiled, and it was the expression of someone who'd been carrying hope for so long that it had crystallized into determination. "How about tomorrow?" As she gathered her documents and prepared to leave, I walked to the desk where Harrison Blackwood's letter from his mother remained in its drawer. I pulled it out, reading again the words about building belonging for people who'd been told they didn't deserve it. The Foundation had grown beyond Harrison's vision, beyond my inheritance, beyond the individual stories that had brought us together. It had become something that could outlast any of us, something that could continue correcting market failures and systematic displacement long after the people who'd started it were gone. My phone buzzed with a message from Patricia. New federal legislation being proposed to regulate predatory landlord practices. House Subcommittee wants Foundation representatives to testify about housing displacement patterns. Interested? I typed back, "Schedule it." Outside, the city continued its constant reconstruction, buildings rising and falling according to forces that most residents never saw but always felt. Inside the penthouse that once seemed impossibly large for someone like me, I sat surrounded by grant applications and policy proposals and architectural plans that represented thousands of people who were building lives on foundations strong enough to support not just their own dreams, but the dreams of people who would come after them. The phone rang one more time before I went to sleep. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar.
Sarah, this is Vivian Morrison. I wanted to thank you again for the Foundation's assistance during my divorce proceedings, but I also wanted to ask if you might be interested in a partnership. I've been working with a group of attorneys who specialize in asset recovery for women whose husbands have hidden marital property. We think there might be opportunities for collaboration. I looked out at the city lights, each one representing someone making choices about how to use whatever power they had, whether to build systems that included everyone or systems that worked only for people who already had enough. I'd be interested in hearing more, I said. After we scheduled a meeting, I turned off the lights and stood at the windows one more time, looking down at the streets where I'd once walked as someone who rented her whole life, someone who wasn't built for ownership, someone who should be grateful for whatever scraps of stability others were willing to provide. Now those same streets looked like a map of possibilities, places where other people were learning the difference between charity and justice, between temporary assistance and permanent change, between being grateful for help and demanding that help shouldn't be necessary. The Harrison Blackwood had given me more than a penthouse. He'd given me the tools to help other people rewrite the stories that had been interrupted by displacement, discrimination, and the particular cruelty of being told that their problems were personal failures rather than systematic violence. Marcus was right about one thing. Everything I had came from someone else's resources, but he'd been wrong about what that meant. It didn't make me smaller or more dependent. It made me responsible to people I'd never met, accountable to problems I hadn't created, invested in solutions that would benefit people whose names I would never know. The foundation would continue growing, expanding, developing new models for community-controlled housing and tenant protection and systematic reform of policies that treated shelter as luxury rather than necessity. Until then, we'd keep correcting the mistakes, one grant at a time, one policy change at a time, one person who discovered that they deserved stability and had the power to demand it not just for themselves, but for everyone else who'd been told that displacement was inevitable and housing was earned rather than fundamental. The city never slept, and neither did, it seemed, justice when it finally had resources to back up its intentions.